Okay, so today I thought I would talk a little bit about the book, which was published, it seems like a while ago. And, you know, when you write a book or article or anything else, and then you kind of look back on it later, like, why did I write that? Or at least, what would I do differently, or what could I do next? And so I hope to just kind of share some of the insights that I gained in the process of working on my first book, and then talk a little bit about what's next and the things that I would like to do and see moving forward. So, okay, just so you know, I'm not going to hold you hostage. The first thing I'll do is talk about Black Mosaic and just kind of outline some of the things I think are helpful here, and talk about the kind of the theoretical apparatus that I developed here, and hopefully to see if it's actually helpful in explaining some of the things that we all see in our kind of daily walk in life and interactions with different kinds of people of color, Black people specifically. But then also, you know, my work, generally speaking, has been about Black immigrants and African Americans. So let me stop right there and just say, I use the term Black immigrants to mean, generally speaking, first and second generation Black people from the Caribbean, from Latin America, from Africa, who come to the U.S., and then second generation are their children. And then I use African American, even though this term is now contested in some ways, to mean people who have longer lineage of in the U.S. Okay. And then I want to talk a little bit about Black politics and transition, because in a way, maybe we can widen our scope about thinking about Black immigration and Black migrants, to think about what happens when Black people move about the country, move from the city to the suburbs, move from the Northeast to the South, move from one neighborhood to the other. I'm really excited to, it's my first time talking about this project with you guys, and it's perfect that I'm doing it here, because does anybody recognize this map? Whoop, whoop, it's Atlanta. Atlanta has a special place in my heart. I got engaged to be married here, so a long time ago. So there it is. All right. So, Black Mosaic is an effort to kind of challenge some of the big names in my field. And, you know, when you're a graduate student, you be feeling yourself, and you're like, I can like challenge everybody. And so that's what I was hoping to do. And, you know, what I love about my job is I mostly get to study whatever I want. And when I see strange things, I get to ask questions about it and figure out what's going on. And when I was in college, these things that I felt like were strange kept happening to me. So my family is from Chicago. We've lived in North Carolina for a very long time. My parents' are from Mississippi. So we've been in the States for a very long time. And in college, people would come up to me and say like, oh, Candis, where are you from? I'd say, North Carolina. I'm like, no, where are you from? Right, and that's the, you know, where are your people, what country are they from? And when I said they're from the States, people thought that was weird, that somehow like somebody like me could be, you know, a high-achieving Black person as a native-born African American. And, you know, I started to pick up on this weird thing. And I had a friend from Miami who told me I was her first African American friend ever. Anyway, so I was like, what is going on here? And I started to just kind of read about Black immigrants and African American politics. And one of the things that popped out in the existing literature at that time was this idea that we are likely to see Black immigrants identify with somebody like me only under the circumstance that they were not doing well or that they were downwardly mobile. And there's a theory called segmented assimilation, which basically says that when Black immigrants are in close proximity to African Americans, they're likely to adopt an adversarial stance to white society or to traditional American values, and that they will basically be subsumed by they're gonna assimilate in the wrong direction. And I found that troubling, mostly because it was an affront to my identity, but also it's not what I necessarily saw in my day-to-day life, that there were students who were immigrants or whose families were who immigrated to the U.S. who identified as Black because they liked being Black, and also because people saw them as Black. And they recognized that they lived in a racialized social system, and to say that they were anything other than that would be inaccurate. So I wanted to get a better sense of what was going on there. There is this kind of understanding in both political science and sociology, they come out on different sides when they get to the end, that there is a link between your identity and your political attitudes and behaviors. So there's this idea that you are ascribed a group identity. We call this group membership. And then over time, you might accept that you belong in that group and you feel a sense of attachment, you have an identification with that group. And then you recognize the status of your group in society, and you might decide that you want to work to maintain that status or to improve that status. We call this group consciousness. And typically, it's said that we ought to expect your sense of group consciousness to influence your political attitudes, behaviors, policy preferences. The political science literature largely suggests that that this kind of identity to politics link is going to lead to kind of a unification of Black politics, right? The best piece of example is like the fact that we see a lot of Black Democrats, for example. Sociology, who's focused on, who had already begun to nuance this issue of Black identity, suggested Black immigrants aren't really gonna, they're gonna almost always distance themselves from African Americans, and so we probably shouldn't expect, we should probably expect more competition between groups than coalition. But again, I didn't really see either of those being always true, even on a college campus. And so I wanted to just kind of delve into this and get a better understanding. And what these two charts show is the one on the left, your left, just shows that over time we have seen an uptick in the number of Black immigrants to the United States. And so on the one hand, we might think seriously about considering what happens to Black politics when we have an increase, when we have more diversity, ethnic diversity. The map over here shows us the kind of the density of Black immigrants across the states. And I bring this up because, if I told you, about 10% of Black people in the U.S. are foreign born, you might be like, well, why are you writing a whole dissertation about this? That's not that many people. But in some states and in some cities, Black immigrants might might compose about a third of the population. So in Miami-Dade County, 38% of Black people are foreign born, and that's not including their children, right? Or in New York, it's about 25%. And even in places like Rhode Island, right, have large foreign-born Black populations. So just kind of taking seriously these kind of changes in the dynamics in the Black population and the increasing diversity of the Black population, and also noting that the Black immigrants that I knew didn't always, distance themselves from Black people, I thought that maybe we should develop a new set of expectations for Black politics when we incorporate these folks. So yeah, maybe we all kind of get grouped together, and then some people are gonna be accepting of that identity, and they're gonna like that identity. That they're gonna feel a sense of unity, a sense of pan-ethnicity, and then other times they're gonna be like, I'm not just Black. There's some of us have experienced that, maybe, I don't know. And we might see distancing. We might see a sense of group consciousness around a racial identity. And in that case, we might expect more unified political outcomes. But we might also see that people have other salient identities that they want to focus on and the issues that correspond to those identities. And we might expect from time to time distancing and competition. So essentially, I guess my goal was to perhaps provide more flexibility in our expectations for Black unity or, fighting. It's not going to always be one or the other, and we need to just figure out under what circumstances, under what context should we expect Black unity, under what context, under what circumstances might we expect competition. And so I developed this idea, this concept of diasporic consciousness, which essentially says, in the cases where your racial identity is made salient, we should expect unity. So for instance, when Amadou Diallo was fatally shot by the police, I'm not sure that the police cared where he was from. And Black people recognized that, and there is a sense of, there's a rally around one's Black identity. I'll come back to this at the end, but we might also think about, on the other hand, the issue of immigration. African Americans have a very tenuous relationship with the politics of immigration because on the one hand, you might see immigrants as being in competition with you. On the other hand, most Black people aren't really into heeding the call of dog whistles around, in anti-immigrant sentiments. So maybe they're a little off-put by immigration, but not the immigrants themselves. And so in this instance, we might see some tug of war between African Americans and Black immigrants on some issues, immigration being the probably most obvious one. Okay, so I want to take you kind of through each of these steps. Black Mosaic takes us through each of these steps for us to think about, like, how might this pan out for us? So first, I want to talk about group identity. And even just kind of thinking about who belongs in a group is a really interesting enterprise because it tells us a lot about who you think is in your community. And who you think is in your community matters for who you think should get stuff, who you think should be included, who do you think should be excluded, who shouldn't get stuff. And so I interviewed about 2.5 people who gave me their thoughts and opinions on a number of things. And this was really the most fun part, because if you ask people questions, they just like tell you stuff. It's odd. If you just listen to people, they tell you all their business. And I found that to be true here as well. So, labels seem superfluous, but they're not, because they tell us who people think are worthy of inclusion in their group. So first I asked people, how do you identify? And I asked African Americans and Black immigrants, but this person says, I know I'm Ashanti in general, but I just refer to myself as Black because I think there's just more commonality, especially like, even though I grew up around a lot of Ghanaian people back home, that they knew were here, grew up around a lot of Ghanaian people. That's because like my parents had Ghanaian people back home that they knew. So that was not artificial, but they already had that context. They already were, in that group. But here, and in high school, in college and in high school, it was rare to find Ghanaian friends. So I would just identify with Black people in general, like anyone who is Black. So that's how I identify myself, but I know specifically that I'm Ghanaian. Okay. And then another person said, in the United States, you always have to explain your racial identity. And you can see the likes. The likes, it is a denotation of millennial, that part where they say, most times people just say, oh, you're Black, and I never corrected them. I still don't. And I just say like, okay. Only when I randomly talk Spanish on the phone with my mom, after people know me a while, they say, oh, you're not just Black? And I say, no, I'm not. But I didn't tell you because I didn't think it mattered. So I'm Black. I look Black, I am Black. If you call me Black, I'm Black. But if you need me to qualify or tell you why, I'm like, well, I'm from Panama, and I'll state that. And what I think is important about both of these, which I think are representative of a lot of the kind of talk on how people identify themselves, is that one, context matters, that it depends where they are. And it's not that they are, jockeying for any particular thing. It's just matters where they are. Two, there's kind of this critical mass thing. Social identities are social. They don't really mean anything if people don't know what they mean. I know that's kind of circular. But, in this case where she says, when I'm in a spot where people don't know where Ghanaian is, I don't say I'm a Ghanaian. That doesn't make any sense for me to do that. I'm Black. Third, we see that people are not identifying as Ghanaian or Panamanian in efforts to distance themselves from Black people, but it's just the fact that it's part of their identity. And it's not to say that there weren't Black immigrants who are very active in distancing themselves from Black people, but there are also a number of people who make the claim around their ethnic identity because that's their lived reality. I also asked people who they thought belongs to the Black community, who is included there. And so one example of that is a person who said, I feel like the Black community is everyone, whether it's, even people who don't always identify. So I think that's Black Americans, I think that's immigrant African Americans, I think that's Black Latinos. I think it's everyone that's in the group that has ties to Africa at some point in time. And so this person has a really broad understanding of what Black identity is and what that means. And what I found is that, one, this kind of answer challenges this business of segmented assimilation. It's not that people are identifying as Black because they're going in the wrong direction, but because they recognize that they live in a racialized social system. They recognize how other people see them, but also because they like being Black. And that's a reason to do it too. And the other thing is, there's also a point of pride and a want, it's also a political identity to say that you're Black. One other thing is that people use the term Black to be all-encompassing. So maybe there's some contestation around African American, but most people use that to refer to the same way I'm using it. But Black was the term that people were like, oh yeah, we're all Black. We're not all African American, but we're all Black. And I thought that was important. Okay. In this business of group consciousness, there's a lot of, the existing literature at the time that I wrote this mostly said that Black immigrants really don't have a sense of group consciousness, that they don't really see a connection between themselves and the racial group, and that identity isn't going to be politicized in the same way. But I found something different. Most of the existing literature at that time was based on Black immigrants from New York and used interview data, which I also use interview data, but I also use large and survey data, so with thousands of people. And essentially what the black bar says, these are people who didn't say that they felt like what happens to them is kind of linked with the larger group. But what we see is that for the most part, Black immigrants and African Americans respond about the same. Actually, this here is the African immigrants in that survey. So ostensibly, they have higher sense of group consciousness than even native-born African Americans. So that was for me an important challenge to the existing literature that said that Black immigrants don't really see themselves as linked to a larger racial group, and that's just not true. What is important to point out is that group consciousness is understood also kind of as a psychological resource to get people to participate in politics, to want to shape their preferences around policies, especially ones that will produce more equity. And so the question is, well, if they have just as much, if not more, group consciousness, do we expect it to produce the same kinds of outcomes? And I find that it doesn't. So for African Americans, group consciousness influences a wide array of policies, even ones that are ostensibly non-racial. So, for example, we might expect group consciousness to lead African Americans to say we should have political districts that make it fair, or for Black people to have the opportunity to elect a representative of their choice, right? Group consciousness, people with higher group consciousness feel like it's important to have that opportunity. People with a higher sense of group consciousness also think we should get reparations, but who doesn't? That was a joke. Okay. But also for African Americans, a sense of group consciousness said that we should have, that people should be able to get abortions if they want. A sense of group consciousness also led people to say that lesbian and gay people should be able to adopt if they want. So there's just kind of a wide array of policy issues around equity that a sense of racial group consciousness influenced them to support. But we didn't see that for Black immigrants. For Black immigrants, it was on very narrow issues like reparations. On the other hand, as far as group consciousness influencing behavior, group consciousness influenced a wider array of behaviors for Black immigrants. So they were more likely to work for campaigns or to write letters to their representatives, and it actually turns out that it wasn't as much of a resource for African Americans, which is contrary to the previous literature. Okay, and then the last step is how all of this comes together for political outcomes. And here, I asked my interview respondents to tell me what the most important political or policy issues were for them. And they said things about healthcare and social welfare, justice, education, prisoners' rights, women's rights, foreign policy, all sorts of things. But what I want to point out is that African American respondents were primarily concerned about education, social welfare, and justice issues. Meanwhile, Black immigrants were really interested in matters around education, healthcare, and immigration. And only one African American respondent said immigration, and it was in passing. So here we have a potential problem, and this is what I'm talking about, that one of the most important issues for Black immigrants is an afterthought for African Americans. And so, granted, this data is based on 30 interview respondents, but it's telling us something. It's telling us about people's priorities. It's telling us about really the limits of descriptive representation. It's telling us something about points of conflict between Native and foreign-born Black folks. It's telling us that we probably have multiple Black agendas instead of one, like instead of the Black agenda, we might think about many Black agendas. And it's really up to people like me to figure out if these are gonna pan out well when they're in competition. Okay. So for me, I thought that all of this was important and helpful and good. But one of the shortcomings of this project was that it was, one, based on kind of limited data. Between the interviews, they provide some evidence for our intuition, and the large survey was the National Survey of American Life, which is a good survey, but it was actually a health survey that had some political questions on it. And I'm not the first person to ask these questions, but one of the first. And so what I really was hoping to see is if I could find more evidence for these claims, if I could find them in different data sets, if I could find them with better data. So that was one, one of the issues was just kind of the scope of the data. The second is that, I'll tell you what the second one is in a second. But I want to, I did have the opportunity to kind of ask some of these questions again because of Jure Capers, who's on the front row right here. She keeps my feet to the fire. And we have written 3 articles together that provide additional evidence for some of the claims that I've made here. So what that means is that you guys are safe to buy the book because I have additional evidence that suggests that I was right the whole time. Okay, so these articles include one about straddling identities. And here what we do in this article is we kind of shift the idea that the connection between a shared racial category and group-based political behavior isn't always cut and dry. Particularly when there are other identities that are equally or maybe even become more salient than one's racial identity, and that there are going to be some policies that trigger particular identities, and we need to be cognizant of that. So, what we find is that when individuals are assessing policies that influence them due to one of their many identities, right? So, I'm Black, I'm a woman, I'm a professor, I'm middle class, I'm a mother, all of these things, that if there's a policy that is specific to one of these identities, that might reign supreme in my decision-making calculus. And we find that individuals are likely to react and respond to policies with the most risked identity at hand. And that makes sense. But typically we kind of think and have treated Black folks as kind of a monolith where their racial identity is the most risked identity. But if we imagine and keep in mind that there are many different kinds of Black people, we can think more about what other kind of risked identities are there that we might think through. And essentially what we find is that immigration, again, is really of high importance to Black immigrants and their children, so first and second generation folks. And African Americans care about immigration, but for different reasons, right? And the reasons are diametrically, the preferences around those interests are diametrically opposed. So here we have people that are seen as monolithic Black folks, but when we start getting into the weeds, we see that they have some policy preferences that are actually are competing with each other. And this is, I mean, in some ways you might be like, well, isn't that always the case, that people have different ideas about what to do? This is different because, you know, we can think about different political ideologies in Black political behavior. We can think about Black liberalism, and we can think about Black conservatism, and we can think about Black feminism. And they have different understandings of the problem, but ultimately they care about the well-being. They're all headed toward the same outcomes to improve the status of the group. In this case, what we have is two groups that have different preferences, that some people would say that doing better for immigrants is doing worse for native-born people. That's a different kind of outcome that we've seen than what we've seen typically. Okay, the second article that we wrote focused on issues around gender. And, you know, we were thinking about, you know, that immigration is both a racialized and a gendered experience. And so, you know, what do we expect for racial group consciousness when we kind of layer on race and ethnicity and gender? And what we find is that immigrants' attitudes on gender equality are influenced by group consciousness in a way that African American women especially isn't. And that was really surprising to us because like we were just like, what? But sometimes that's helpful in finding things that we just don't know what's going on, mostly because what it told us is that maybe we need to think better about the measures that we use around group consciousness, that we might think in a more nuanced way about how race and gender and ethnicity pile up on each other to influence political attitudes and behaviors. And then finally, we wanted to get into, you know, the thing that people know, maybe are more familiar with, is like partisanship. Like, what do we expect for Black immigrants' partisanship? Black immigrants, on average, are more educated than African Americans. They tend to have higher incomes than African Americans. And traditional models of partisanship say that people with more money tend to be more conservative and tend to be Republican. And we don't really see that among African Americans, and we were curious to know if that was going to carry over for Black immigrants. And what we found was that while Afro-Caribbeans specifically were more likely to be Republicans than African Americans, there really is like a similar asymmetry in partisanship, that most Afro-Caribbeans are Democrats. And there are a number of policy domains where Black immigrants' attitudes lean conservative, lean toward the sentiments of Republicans more, but those issues like foreign policy, where they lean toward the Republican side, weren't the issues that galvanized their partisan decisions. That instead it was other kind of equity issues that led them to be Democrats than these kind of foreign policy issues that would lead them perhaps to be Republicans. But I want to make clear that historically, you know, African Americans have a whole history with the GOP, and it's not a pretty one. I think you guys know about that. And so, you know, there's not, it seems like there's like a kind of constraint, you know, it's like nobody, oh, wait, hold on. Let me decide what example I want to use. Started to say something about Stacey Dash. I think I've said it. Okay, there. Okay. So, there's just a little bit, there's a contention there, right, about what a Black Republican looks like or what that means. But it's different for newcomers, right? Newcomers don't have that same relationship with the parties. And historically, Black immigrants were the first people to leave the party of Lincoln, right? They were like, we don't owe that party nothing. We are going to go over here. We're going to be communists. We're going to be Democrats. And so, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And so I only mention this just to say that, maybe if Republicans play their cards right, we might see a certain group of Black people to move parties, right? They have a different relationship. And we have to keep in mind, right, ethnic diversity means that we're going to have a bunch of different kinds of relationship with policy, with the parties, preferences, so on and so forth. Okay. So, mostly what this kind of body of work suggests is that Black politics more or less is becoming more complex. And due to diversification of different kinds of Black people, in this case, ethnic diversification. I find that there are an increasing number of findings that just don't align with the historical literature, that in some ways we need to perhaps update these things, update what we know, use data that doesn't assume that everyone in the U.S. all the Black people are from the U.S. So there's that. The other thing, I told you that there was a second issue. The first was the data and the scope. The other thing that was a shortcoming in this body of work that I've done is that it doesn't really take account local context. Most of the data is national data, so they just kind of do this broad brush about average this person, average that person. So I grew up in North Carolina, and in North Carolina, for most of my life, you were either a Black person or a white person. When Latinx people moved to the Triangle, people were like, "Oh, are you Black or white?" Right? I have a friend who's from Kuwait. They're just like, "You just light-skinned Black guy," right? And it's just kind of a very dichotomous situation. And so, if you were Ethiopian, that has no purchase, for the most part in North Carolina, where if you were in DC, that would mean something. And so one of the things that this work doesn't do is to capture those local dynamics where social identities mean different things, where you might have a critical mass of folks whose interests you really need to take care of. And so moving forward, I really wanted to keep this in mind. So, again, we bring back the same map that I showed you at the beginning. I think it's important that we start thinking more about Black politics at the local level again, right? What do we expect for Black politics in Detroit versus Dade County? What do we expect for Los Angeles, that has like 12,000 Black immigrants, or New York City that has hundreds of thousands of Black immigrants, where you can't ignore their interests, or Massachusetts or Rhode Island. So that's one. The other is to perhaps broaden our understanding of Black migration and think about, for example, as Black people across ethnic groups are moving to different neighborhoods, are moving out of the cities, and are moving from places like New York to the suburbs of Atlanta, for example. What are our expectations as people are just kind of moving across space? And then what happens when we think about as Black people are moving out of spaces because they are forced out, or because they're gentrifiers? And of course there is a debate about if Black people can be gentrifiers, but we can talk about that later too. So I wanted to just kind of think about more ways that Black people might, what happens when we have a movement of Black people across space. So on my way, in between projects, I gathered together a collection of works and put them together in Black Politics and Transition. And here, there are a number of articles that talk about suburbanization. There's two. One by Ernest McGowan, who basically makes the claim that moving to increasingly white spaces might actually radicalize Black people as they kind of reject some of the anti-Black racism that is common in those very white spaces. And Royal Rogers, on the hand, they kind of spar, who suggests maybe not. Maybe as people move away from their communities, maybe we expect those attitudes to be tempered or maybe become more conservative. But, aside from this debate, I think what they both help us to think about is, we tend to think about suburbs as predominantly white, pristine places. But, suburbs actually are really representative of the American population in that 35% of people who live in suburbs are people of color. Most Black people live in suburbs, not in central cities. And so maybe we need to start focusing more on these spaces and not just the central cities that we've been doing in the past, right? The landscape of suburbs are different, right? We can think about transportation. We can think about availability of jobs. The problems are different, right? We can think about Ferguson, Missouri, right? How their municipality was funded through basically harassing Black people. That the politics are different, right? That in suburbs it might be easier to carve out school districts so people can have all white school districts, for example. And these, I think, I'm hoping that we as political scientists start studying these spaces more, because more Black people live in them and more different kinds of Black people live in them. And then we can think about gentrification more and neighborhood change. And there are two chapters, one written by Jessica Stewart, who helps us to kind of see that Blacks in the Midwest and the Northeast are more susceptible to the negative effects of gentrification than folks in the South. And one of the reasons is because there's just no place to go. The housing stock is older in those places. And in the South, there's building stuff everywhere, right? And it's cheaper and it's more, people can afford homes, right? And there are more Black homeowners in the South than anywhere else in the country. And we know that property ownership is political, right? And so she helps us to think through these regional differences as Black people are kind of moving back down south and what that might mean for Black politics as people are moving around. And then Sada challenged us to think about the downsides of multiracial neighborhoods, in that we typically think about if we can just move up to and diversify white spaces. But what she finds is that when Black middle class people get to multiracial neighborhoods, they are not necessarily welcomed. And so what does that mean? How do people negotiate their status in multiracial neighborhoods? And then finally, coming back around to this issue of immigration, we have authors here thinking about coalitions again between Black immigrants and African Americans in a place like New York, where you really do have to consider those interests. But also these chapters challenge us to think about the well-being of Black people in majority cities, where the minority, people of color are made of Black folks and immigrants of color. In the 70s and 80s, many cities were in decline. And so what that meant is that, you had a Black mayor, but you didn't have the capital. And now we see that there are a number of cities with Black mayors and a welcoming of capital, but for example, Durham. Durham is a bustling place. I make decent money, and there are like so many good restaurants and a co-op. That's for people like me, right? That's not for people that have been living in Durham for 20 and 30 years. And so what happens to long-term Black residents as capital is, moving into the city, but with white bodies as well, and whose interests are really being cared for as people are moving around. And then finally, I would say Nyambi Carter really helps us to think about like what exactly is a sanctuary city? Who is it safe for? Are Black people also protected in a sanctuary city? How far does that help us? How far does that concept extend? So on this latter point, and this is my last thing that I bring up, is that I want to note that undocumented immigrants, Black immigrants, are more likely to be deported than any other kind of Black immigrant. And so, obviously we're kind of in a moment of crises where on the one hand, white nationalists are walking, they are like out of the shadows of the internet and walking and chanting and having vigils around toppled Confederate statues on the one hand, and then on the other hand, people have no qualms with unleashing anti-immigrant sentiments. And so what happens if you're a person in the crosshairs of anti-Black racism and anti-immigrant sentiment? And so I guess, the question is, are Black people, African Americans, going to come to the side of their undocumented co-ethnics or, racial group members? And I asked this question in an article about, do all Black lives matter to Black people? And here we see that when we ask Black people, how important is it to consider the challenges of different kinds of Black people, we see that not all Black lives matter, that Black women matter, that formerly incarcerated Black people matter, but undocumented immigrants, people are kind of like, they're okay, maybe. And then definitely not for gay, lesbian, and transgender Black folks. So I guess needless to say, as new identities, as people are being more cognizant of the different identities that Black people have, be they gay or lesbian or immigrant, there are new challenges that Black people have because of those identities, and the jury is out about what the next steps are. So with that, I say thank you.